Social democracy can be best described as advocating economic and social interventions to promote social justice within the framework of a liberal democratic polity and a capitalist-oriented mixed economy. I personally consider myself to be a social democrat, and in this video I'm going to talk about why I prefer social democracy as compared to other systems, particularly conservatism, libertarianism, socialism, and communism. Note, I'll be going over socialism and communism more broadly, and will be defining socialism as simply collective ownership of the means of production, and communism as a stateless, moneyless, classless society with worker ownership of the means of production. If you are a leftist and you think my criticisms in this video do not apply to your ideology, please let me know in the comments why they do not apply. Libertarianism is a political philosophy that advocates only minimal state intervention in the free market and the private lives of citizens. In other words, a laissez-faire, deregulated capitalist economic system. In this section of the video, I'm going to explain why I am against this system and why I think my system will be superior in the perspective of a rule utilitarian, which is my philosophy. The biggest problem that I see with laissez-faire economics is the existence of negative market externalities, which occur when consumption or production of a good causes a harmful effect to society. The biggest example of this is pollution, as both consumption and production of goods can cause pollution of our environment. Given this inevitable fact, you cannot just do nothing against climate change. There needs to be a governing body that exists to account for these negative externalities. In this example, doing environmental regulation and environmental spending in order to help improve the environment. Another reason why I am against libertarianism is that I am pro-welfare, and I think that one of the main jobs of the government is to give people in need in a manner that improves the country. According to the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, welfare is shown to be a good long-term investment. Welfare has also contributed to slashing poverty in half over the past 50 years, according to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and there's other numerous benefits that I will link in the description of this video. In addition to being economically good, welfare also leads to social benefits, such as the decrease in the crime rate, according to the Journal of Criminal Justice. In addition, citizens find life more rewarding as the generosity of the welfare state increases, net of economic or cultural conditions, according to perspectives on politics. I will link more research on the social impact of welfare in the description. This is a very common myth, but right now I'm going to debunk it. In 18 European countries, increasing employment commitment happens as social spending gets more generous and activating, according to work, employment, and society. In addition, Medicaid has little, if any, impact on labor market outcomes in Oregon, according to American Economic Review, and has also increased high school graduation rates, according to Journal of Human Resources. While private charity can do some good, it is not nearly enough to fully tackle the problems we face as a country. According to the Center on Philanthropy at Indiana University, only 30.3% of private charity could be focused on meeting the basic needs of the poor. In addition, public spending correlates with decreased poverty, while private spending does not, according to the People's Policy Project. Another problem that I have with libertarianism is that some industries are better owned by the government than owned by private companies. The biggest example of this that libertarians disagree with is healthcare. According to PLOS, public sector healthcare tends to be of higher quality than private sector. In addition, a literature review of 69 studies finds that VA hospitals do better on safety and effectiveness than private hospitals, according to the Journal of General Internal Medicine. And Americans with state healthcare are more satisfied with their experience in private plans, according to Gallup. According to Health Systems Tracker, countries with universal health care besides Sweden and Canada have lower wait times than the US. Socialism can most broadly be defined as collective ownership over the means of production by workers. It can come in many different shapes and sizes, and today I'll be going over two broader sections, which are Marxism-Leninism and Libertarian Socialism. The economic calculation problem says that without a proper pricing system, you cannot properly allocate factors of production that best suit the subjective values of consumers. Mises' analogy to describe this goes as follows. The director wants to build a house. Now there are many methods that can be resorted to. Each of them offers, from the point of view of the director, certain advantages and disadvantages with regard to the utilization of future building. It results in a different duration of the building's serviceableness. Each of them requires other expenditures of building materials and labor and absorbs other periods of production. Which method should the director choose? He cannot reduce to a common denominator the items of various material and various kinds of labor to be expended, therefore he cannot compare them. He cannot attack either the waiting time, period of production, or to the duration of serviceability, a definite numerical expression. In short, he cannot, in comparing costs to be expended and gains to be earned, resort to any arithmetical operation. The plans of his architects enumerate a vast multiplicity of various items in kind. They refer to the physical and chemical qualities of various items in kind. They refer to the physical productivity of various machines, tools, and procedures, but all their statements remain unrelated to each other. There's no means of establishing any connection between them. I consider this to be the final blow to socialism, and I will now begin to refute very common debunks of the ECP. The linear programming solution is not a response to the economic calculation problem because it assumes we live in a static general equilibrium, when in reality we live in a dynamic economy in ever-changing conditions. Even if it did address the economic calculation problem, we still run into the computation problem. Even with quantum computers, we still don't have the computation power to solve the utility functions of everyone. Linear programming just tells us the relationship between different inputs and outputs, and that's not the problem proposed by the ECP. It doesn't give us a common denominator to measure different factors of production. It could tell us if we use X and Y and about how that would affect the output, but it can't tell us if we should use X or Y in a dynamic economy. If we have a stationary economy where we all decide that we want to produce one thing, it can tell us what to produce, but this just isn't the case in real life. The main problem with any supposed solution to the economic calculation problem that involves the utilization of labor hours is the failure to recognize the heterogeneous nature of labor. Say a doctor spends 1 hour of his labor performing brain surgery. Let the value of that labor be represented by Y. Now, say that a driver spends 1 hour of his labor dropping off food for Uber Eats. Let the value of that labor be represented by X. We know that X is not equal Y, and we know this because of the previously mentioned fact regarding the heterogeneous nature of labor. The reason labor being heterogeneous matters is because it means it cannot be used as a common denominator to commensurate different factors of production. Labor hours could only be effective at solving the ECP if central planners can establish an interpersonal utility function, which is of course impossible given the subjective nature of value. Then we need to determine how much each subject values each service/product and be able to compare the utility interpersonally, not to mention the physical impossibilities that result from ever trying to compute all of this information. See the computation problem. Even if the technological information of production functions, the curve which best represents the physical output possibilities of various inputs can be communicated to the central planner. This would be far from helping him produce economically. You need to know the relative scarcities of the factors of production, not the curves that represent physical output, but which production method to pick out of a myriad of ways to produce a commodity. Suppose a product worth $50 can be produced by 5 units of A, 6 units of B, and 3 units of C, or by 2 units of A, 8 units of B, and 4 units of C. In a market economy, we can see that if the price of A is higher relative to the price of B and C, the second method of production will be less costly. The central planner lacks this information because there is no market for the goods A, B, and C. Even with this, there will not be enough once it is known which is one of the methods of the production is cheaper. There remains the problem of how much to produce of each good with any given method. Given that the prices of a good diminish as the supply increases, entrepreneurs can estimate if the increase in the number of goods produced with more factors of production will yield a higher profit. These types of estimates and calculations are only possible with real market prices. Lange's solution is not much different than the one Taylor initially proposed. These parametric prices will be adjusted under the trial and error method. If the demand for some production goes to exceed the supply, prices are increased. And if the supply exceeds demand, parametric prices are lowered to clear the market. We need not repeat the points we have already mentioned. They continue to remain relevant. One last comment we can make on the trial and error method is that the concept of surplus and shortages are dependent on the subjective judgment of the entrepreneur. The fact that there are shirts on the shelves of the store does not mean that there is a surplus of shirts. The seller will hold back from lowering prices and selling the shirts if he believes he'll be able to find customers that are willing to pay the existing price. It is crucial to repeat yet again that prices are not formed by the intersection of supply and demand curves. These curves do not exist in reality but are merely a useful tool to comprehend the bidding process that occurs in the market. Prices spring from the interactions of flesh and blood actors who are trying to forecast future conditions. Market socialism isn't a solution to the economic calculation problem as it was originally proposed because, depending on which form of it could just be the government still owning the factors of production. It would just create different bureaus. You're not transferring anything here since the government is still the owner of all these bureaus. Even with worker ownership as opposed to state ownership, it still runs into the economic calculation problem. Under market socialism, there's still the inability of allocating the factors of production efficiently, and there's still the inability to establish a quantitative relationship between different methods of producing goods, because these prices would be based on whimsical guesses of future conditions within the market, thus they do not relay true information. Due to firms within market socialism being democratically owned by workers, there's an inability for them to see the actual return rate of their decisions. Everyone gets a single vote per share. This results in a loss of knowledge as it distorts more signals for the investors, not to mention that the capital structure of these firms are weak in comparison with a capitalist firm. The reason for this is that everyone gets one vote. They all use this vote to vote where investment should go within the company, which subsequently results in a loss of knowledge. Furthermore, without the social order of capital goods, you cannot make meaningful ontological inputs within the utilization of economic knowledge. The People's Republic of Walmart is not a solution to the economic calculation problem. Walmart uses prices to determine whether or not to do certain things. They still have a common denominator to compare different factors of production to commensurate them. In addition, Walmart is a merchandising business, so they only deal with distribution, not allocating the factors of production, so it's a straw man of the ECP. If we have different firms producing different things in these communes, then this is just a market. And if we just have a bunch of essentially planned communes in which these essentially planned communes are trading with each other, in which case we still don't have a way to commensurate different factors of production. There's no common denominator to commensurate different factors of production. It's an aggregate production function. It doesn't let us commensurate different factors of production. Participatory economics proposes a system in which central planners communicate with the participating individuals, supposedly living in a commune together to coordinate and meet the needs/wants of the people. The issue here is that the economic calculation problem deals with allocating the factors of production. It does not deal with the distribution of goods and services. Even under an economy that utilizes participatory economics, central planners could not, without a market-based price system, determine how to allocate these factors of production rationally. Having your planner work for profit in reality does not debunk the economic calculation problem. No matter the motive and more of a production is irrelevant to the question as to how do we produce goods properly. It runs into the same as the original economic calculation problem and is a straw man of what it is saying. It assumes that the ECP says that without a market you can't distribute goods. It is not what the economic calculation problem is saying at all, as previously established. It deals with production, not distribution. This just stems from a lack of knowledge of what the ECP is. The ECP applies to planned economies because they don't have prices that act as a common denominator to allow us to commensurate different factors of production. In a centrally planned economy, prices cannot form for these higher order goods. Thus, the economic calculation is not possible. In a market system, these prices do exist. Therefore, the ECP does not apply. A relative abundance does not equate to a post-scarcity economy. This study conducted by Cockshot does not at all refute the ECP, as labor is a factor of production which can only be valued through market exchange ratios. Therefore, labor hours cannot be used as a common denominator to commensurate different factors of production. In the study, Cockshot relies on misapplied regression from labor input to output of the business sector input-output tables. These input-output tables have various flaws. They do not account for substitution, they have no internal mechanism to account for price adjustments, and there have also been numerous instances throughout history where an increase in input does not correspond with an increase in output. An example of such would be the 1947 US automobile industry input-output table. As a reference for economic productivity or wealth creation, input-output tables are even less reliable than GDP, because with GDP the factors taken into consideration when formulating the data aren't entirely arbitrary as they are with input-output tables, and so input-output tables cannot be used to solve the problem. Furthermore, any planning based on labor hours still requires us to establish an interpersonal utility function in order to compare the weights of labor values between multiple people and industries. And even if the central planners can establish an interpersonal utility function, which is of course impossible given the subjective nature of value, then we need to determine how much each subject values each service/product and be able to compare the utility interpersonally, not to mention the physical impossibilities that result from ever trying to compute all this information. See computation problem. Calculation in kind is not interindustrial, which means you cannot compare different kinds between industries, i.e., you cannot compare volts of electricity to the amount of milk a cow produces for numerous reasons. This means you don't solve the economic calculation problem at all. Its prices are inter-industrial, which this unit is not. There are also other flaws, such as there being no way to differentiate between resources in a country and resources being used. Another problem that I have with Marxism-Leninism is that whenever it has been tried, it has been a miserable failure, contrary to what MLs would like to tell themselves. According to the Council of Economic Advisors, in the USSR, the collectivization of agriculture occurred within the first 5-year plan, 1928 to 32. Horses were important for doing the farm work, but their numbers fell by 47%, in part because nobody had much incentive to care for them when they became collective property. In the Central Asian parts of the USSR, the number of cattle fell more than 75%, and the number of sheep more than 90%. According to the official Soviet data for about 1970, the entire suite of socialist policies, excessive centralization of the planning, control, and management of agriculture, inappropriate price policies, and defective incentive systems for farm managers and workers, and for enterprises that supply inputs to agriculture, was reducing Soviet agriculture productivity about 50%. In addition, a sociological study carried out by Soviet economists found that 23% of the population was poor, and 60% of the respondents in the Soviet sample thought that their spaces were either inadequate or grossly inadequate. Basic equipment like sanitation or water supply improved throughout the decades, but didn't fully reach everyone by 1975, especially in smaller towns according to Intel. This is a very popular myth among leftist circles. According to Lyakov 20, in the early 20th century, Russian manufacturing was not economically underdeveloped. The productivity gap between Great Britain and Russia was not that significant. While the British productivity lead was evident in textiles, paper, clay, stone, and mining, Russia was ahead in the alcohol, tobacco, rubber, and petrochemical industries. Although Russia was behind in the metals industry, the gap with Britain was not large. When compared to France, Russia's productivity was on par with them. However, this all stopped when Russia embraced more socialist ideals in the USSR. For example, research that examined a technology called steelmaking, which appeared in the 1950s, allowed for the production of cheaper and higher quality steel. By 1980, the US had multiplied their fraction of steelmaking by 5 and Italy by 12.5, while the Soviet Union just increased by a factor of 2.75. From 1980 to 1987, the US dominated with an increase of 2.9, followed by Italy with 1.8, and finally the Soviet Union with just 1.45. In addition, according to Ruscorp 14, as you can see in the chart displayed on screen, Russia was actually pretty industrialized before the Soviet Revolution. This is contrary to the communist idea that Russia was a backwater agrarian country and that socialism industrialized the nation. So this means that Russia was already quite developed, and then socialism came along and stagnated the growth. I will link more resources on the USSR's failure in the description. Maoist China was marked with constant failure after failure, and it is a good example of why socialism fails. According to 2 MBER studies, China's poverty in 1980 is attributable to the impact of the Maoist path since 1950. Further checks and tests suggest that, if anything, this is likely to be an understatement, and Mao's policies resulted in slower growth rates when compared to the post-reform policies. According to the same Council of Economic Advisors studies before, in Cuba, the disincentives inherent in the socialist policies sharply reduced agricultural production. As O'Connor explains, because wage rates bore little or no relationship to labor productivity and state farm income, there were few incentives for workers to engage wholeheartedly in a collective effort. Research has analyzed the change in agricultural production in Cuba spanning the agrarian reform period of 1959 to 63, when about 70% of the farmland was nationalized. Production of livestock fell between 14% fish and 84% pork. Among the major crops, production fell between 5% rice and 75% malanga. The biggest crop, sugar, fell 35%. The CEA also notes that while Cuba had similar gross national income to Puerto Rico before the Cuban Revolution in the late 1950s, by 2000, Cuban gross national income had fallen almost 2/3 relative to Puerto Rico. In addition, according to Herrera 19, almost 70% of Cubans do not have a permanent water supply. 32% have water between 4 to 5 days, 28% have it fewer than 3 days, and 8.1% do not have drinking water service. 6 out of 10 citizens have suffered up to 10 power cuts in recent months, while 18.8% have suffered more than 10. This is another common myth among leftist circles. According to Coleman 21, U.S. economic sanctions with respect to Cuba generally had a minimal overall historical impact on the Cuban economy. Cuba adjusted quickly to U.S. economic sanctions through political and economic alliance with the Soviet bloc countries. Soviet economic assistance, which peaked at nearly $6 billion annually in the 1980s, largely offset any adverse effects of U.S. sanctions and enabled the Cuban economy to grow. The loss of Soviet economic assistance after 1990 caused a severe downturn in the Cuban economy, bringing to the forefront long-standing inefficiencies in the Cuban economy. The loss of Soviet assistance eventually forced Cuba to introduce economic reforms to attract foreign investment and selective economic liberalization to stimulate domestic production. Also, according to Chicago Booth 12, states the fact that most economic economists agree that Cuba's low per capita income growth, 1.2% per year since 1960, has more to do with Cuba's own economic policies than with the U.S. embargo on trade and tourism. To make a long story short, social democracy is simply just a more pragmatic way to fix the same issues that socialists want to solve, whether that be universal high quality healthcare, guaranteed adequate housing, and generally just a higher standard of living where people's needs are met in an adequate fashion. To conclude this section, I went over the economic calculation problem as well as debunking responses to it. I also went over historical failures of the Marxist-Leninist system. I think that this is an adequate response to both libertarian socialism and Marxist-Leninism, and I will now be going over to conservatism. My problems with conservatism economically are already covered in the libertarianism section, but in this section I will be explaining why I am not in line with conservative social views. I am not going to go over every specific issue, but I am generally more socially left and therefore I do not consider myself a conservative. I am pro-LGBTQ+, pro-BLM, I think systemic racism exists, I want police reform, etc. In this video, I went over libertarianism, libertarian socialism, Marxism-Leninism, and briefly went over conservatism, since I really only disagree with it because I am generally just socially left-wing. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys in the next one, and if anyone has any criticisms of what I said in this vid, let me know in the comments.